Kaya Thompson thought she was just working another catering shift to pay for her mother's chemotherapy until she took the wrong elevator and walked into a Korean Mafia meeting. Now the most dangerous man in Seoul has decided she knows too much to ever leave his sight. At 24, Kaya balanced serving trays and her mother's medical bills with the desperate precision of someone who had learned that every dollar mattered. She worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and had exactly $847 in her savings account against $12,000 in medical debt that grew larger every month. Tonight she was catering an exclusive event at Seoul Tower's penthouse level, her black uniform pressed, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized the elegant line of her neck and the determined set of her jaw. She had warm brown skin that seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the service kitchen, and eyes that held both exhaustion and unshakable resolve. Her dream was simple: keep her mother alive long enough for the new treatment to work, and maybe, someday, sleep through the night without calculating medical bills. The elevator was supposed to stop at the 42nd floor. Kaya had ridden it 6 times already, carrying champagne and hors d'oeuvres to Seoul's wealthy elite, her feet aching in the required heels, her smile professionally pleasant despite the bone-deep fatigue. But when the doors opened on the 4th to 5th floor instead, she stepped out automatically, muscle memory carrying the heavy tray before her brain registered the difference. The hallway was different here. Quieter, darker, expensive in a way that felt deliberate rather than showy, with custom lighting and what looked like original artwork lining walls covered in silk wallpaper that probably cost more than Kaya's rent. She took 3 steps toward what she assumed was another dining room before she heard voices speaking in rapid Korean, the tone sharp and businesslike in a way that made something cold settle in her stomach. She should have turned around. She should have backed into the elevator and pretended she had never been there. Instead, she froze as the voices grew clearer, as her brain processed the few Korean words she recognized from her language classes: money, territory, blood, silence. The door to the private dining room was slightly ajar. Through the gap, Kaya could see 5 men in expensive suits seated around a mahogany table that reflected the light from a crystal chandelier. Stacks of cash sat in neat piles between them, more money than Kaya had ever seen in one place. Maps were spread across one end of the table, marked with red ink in patterns that looked like territorial divisions. One man was speaking quietly while sliding a photograph across the polished surface, and Kaya's blood turned to ice when she glimpsed what looked like a crime scene. She knew she was looking at something she was never supposed to see. These were not the wealthy businessmen attending the charity gala downstairs. This was something else entirely, something dangerous, something that explained the excessive security and the separate elevator access, and the way the regular catering staff had been told explicitly not to come to this floor. Kaya began to back away slowly, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give her away. Her hands trembled around the silver tray, champagne glasses clinking softly together despite her efforts to keep them steady. She had taken exactly 2 steps toward safety when her heel caught on the thick Persian rug, and she stumbled, the tray tilting dangerously as she fought to regain her balance. The conversation stopped immediately. Silence stretched through the hallway like a held breath, heavy and threatening and absolute. Kaya stood perfectly still, hoping desperately that they hadn't heard, that she could still slip away unnoticed, that this nightmare would end with her safely back in the service elevator. Then a voice spoke from the dining room, low and controlled, and speaking perfect English with just the faintest trace of a Korean accent. Did someone order room service? It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement that someone was there, someone who didn't belong, someone who had seen what they weren't supposed to see. Kaya's throat closed completely as footsteps approached the door, measured and unhurried. The sound of someone who had never needed to run from anything in his life. The door opened fully, and Kaya found herself staring at the most dangerous-looking man she had ever seen. He was tall for a Korean man, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of sharp, sculpted features that belonged on magazine covers rather than in rooms full of criminal evidence. His suit was black and perfectly tailored, the kind of expensive that whispered rather than shouted, and when he moved there was a controlled precision to every gesture that suggested violence held in careful check. His dark hair was swept back from his face, and his eyes were the color of black coffee and twice as unforgiving. Park Jin-woo had built his empire on the principle that witnesses were liabilities and liabilities were eliminated quickly and quietly. He had been discussing the territorial expansion of his organization's drug distribution network when the sound of clinking glass interrupted his concentration. Now he stood in the doorway studying the young black woman who held a serving tray with hands that shook despite her obvious efforts to appear calm. She was beautiful in an understated way, with natural elegance that had nothing to do with the expensive clothes and jewelry worn by the women who usually caught his attention. Her catering uniform was simple and professional, but it couldn't hide the graceful line of her shoulders or the intelligence in her dark eyes. She was terrified, that much was obvious, but she hadn't screamed or fainted or done any of the dramatic things he might have expected. Instead, she stood her ground and met his gaze directly, her chin lifted in a gesture that spoke of dignity even in the face of mortal fear. "What's your name?" Park Jin-woo asked quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made seasoned criminals step carefully. "Kaya Thompson," she replied, her voice steadier than she had any right to expect under the circumstances. "I'm with the catering company. I think I took the wrong elevator." He studied her for a long moment, taking in the expensive serving tray, the professional uniform, the genuine confusion and terror in her expression. Behind him, he could hear his associates shifting restlessly, waiting for his decision. The smart play was obvious. Eliminate the witness, dispose of the body, ensure that their business remained private. It was what he had done a dozen times before without hesitation. But something about Kaya Thompson made him pause. Maybe it was the way she didn't try to lie or make excuses, didn't attempt to charm her way out of danger or promise things she couldn't deliver. She had given him her real name without hesitation, met his eyes without flinching, and accepted responsibility for her mistake without trying to shift blame. In his world, that kind of honesty was rare enough to be remarkable. "Did you see anything interesting in my dining room, Miss Thompson?" he asked, stepping closer until she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact. Kaya's heart was beating so fast she felt lightheaded, but she forced herself to think clearly. Lying would be stupid. He obviously knew she had seen something. But the truth was equally dangerous. She settled for something in between, a response that acknowledged reality without providing details. "I saw enough to know I shouldn't be here," she said quietly, "and enough to know that forgetting what I saw would be in everyone's best interest." Park Jin-woo smiled then, a slow curve of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes but carried a hint of genuine approval. Intelligence and honesty. In his experience, most people possessed one or the other, but rarely both. Miss Thompson was proving to be an interesting anomaly. "Unfortunately," Jin-woo said, his tone almost conversational, "forgetting isn't really an option anymore. You've seen my associates, my business, my private space. That kind of knowledge makes you either an asset or a liability, and I don't leave liabilities unresolved." Kaya felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words sank in. She thought of her mother in the hospital bed, waiting for treatment that Kaya couldn't afford, depending on income from jobs like this one. She thought of the medical bills and the student loans and the rent payment due next week. She thought of all the people who were counting on her to keep working, keep earning, keep surviving. "I understand," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "What happens now?" "Now," Park Jin-woo replied, studying her face with the intensity of a man who made life-and-death decisions based on split-second character assessments. "You come with me. We have some things to discuss." Park Jin-woo's private office occupied the entire northwest corner of the 4th to 5th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Seoul's glittering skyline. The space was a study in controlled luxury, from the custom Italian leather furniture to the original Korean artwork that hung on walls lined with dark wood panels. Everything was expensive but understated, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted, designed to intimidate through quality rather than ostentation. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface clear except for a single laptop and a crystal paperweight that caught and refracted the city lights beyond the windows. Kaya stood in the center of the room where Jin-woo had positioned her, still holding the serving tray because no one had told her to put it down. Her hands had stopped shaking, But her heart continued its frantic rhythm as she took in the evidence of power that surrounded her. The security system was state-of-the-art, with cameras positioned at strategic angles and what looked like bulletproof glass in the windows. Two men in expensive suits flanked the door, their faces professionally blank, but their positions clearly defensive. Everything about the space suggested money, influence, and the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. Jinwoo moved behind his desk with the fluid grace of a predator, settling into his chair without taking his eyes off Kaya's face. He had removed his suit jacket, revealing a white dress shirt that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and the subtle movement emphasized the controlled strength in his frame. His hands rested on the desk surface, manicured but not soft, the hands of someone who had built his empire through both intellect and violence. "Put the tray down, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that made disobedience seem impossible. "We're going to have a conversation." Kaya set the silver tray on a nearby side table, grateful to free her hands, but acutely aware that she now had nothing to hold, nowhere to direct her nervous energy. She clasped her hands behind her back and waited, meeting Jinwoo's steady gaze with as much composure as she could manage. She had learned long ago that showing weakness invited exploitation, and even though this situation was far beyond anything she had ever experienced, the principle remained the same. "Tell me exactly what you saw in that room," Jinwoo began, his tone conversational, but his eyes sharp and assessing. "Every detail, every face, every word you understood." Kaya took a breath, organizing her thoughts carefully. Lying would be pointless. He obviously knew she had seen something significant. But providing too much detail might make her seem like a threat rather than an innocent bystander. She chose her words with the precision of someone whose life might depend on them. "I saw 5 men around a table with stacks of money and what looked like maps," she said steadily. "One man was showing photographs that I didn't want to look at closely. The conversation was in Korean, but I recognized a few words from my language classes. Territory, money, blood, silence." Jinwoo leaned back slightly, studying her with the intensity of someone who made critical decisions based on microexpressions and vocal inflections. "What classes?" he asked. "Basic Korean language and culture," Kaya replied. "I've been taking them at the community college for 2 years. I thought learning Korean might help me find better work in Seoul's international district." "Interesting," Jinwoo murmured. "And who sent you to that floor tonight?" "No one sent me," Kaya said, a flash of frustration breaking through her careful composure. "I pressed the wrong button on the elevator. I was exhausted. I've been working since 6 this morning, and I made a mistake. I didn't even know that floor existed until 20 minutes ago." Jinwoo watched her carefully, noting the genuine irritation in her voice, the way her shoulders straightened slightly when she defended herself. Most people became more submissive when questioned by him, more eager to please, more desperate to say whatever they thought he wanted to hear. Kaya Thompson seemed to be growing more direct, more honest, more herself. It was either very brave or very stupid, and he was beginning to suspect it was the former. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, his voice softer but somehow more dangerous. "Why should I trust that you're not working for the Yamamoto Syndicate or the Chinese Triads, or any of the other organizations that would pay handsomely for information about my business?" Kaya felt her heart skip as she recognized the trap in the question. He wasn't just asking about her loyalties. He was confirming that what she had witnessed was significant enough that rival criminal organizations would value the intelligence. She was standing in the office of a man who commanded respect and fear from other crime syndicates, a man whose business was valuable enough to warrant assassination attempts and corporate espionage. "Because I had never heard of any of those organizations until you just mentioned them," she said quietly. "Because I'm a catering server who makes $12 an hour plus tips. And if I was smart enough to be a spy, I probably wouldn't be working 3 jobs to pay my mother's hospital bills. And because if I wanted to betray you, I would have called the police from the elevator instead of walking into your office and giving you my real name." The logic was sound, and Jinwoo found himself almost smiling at her directness. She had a point. Actual intelligence operatives rarely identified themselves so readily or provided such easily verifiable personal information. His background check on Kaya Thompson would be completed within the hour, but his instincts were already telling him what he would find. a young woman struggling to support a sick parent, working multiple jobs, desperate for money but fundamentally honest. "Tell me about your mother," he said, changing tactics in a way that seemed casual but was actually designed to test her emotional responses. Kaya's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. "Breast cancer," she said simply. "Stage 3. The insurance covered the basic treatment, but the experimental therapy that might actually save her costs $30,000 out of pocket. I've been working every shift I can get, saving every dollar, but it's not enough. It's never enough." The pain in her voice was genuine, raw, impossible to fake. Jin-woo had heard countless lies and manipulations in his career, but grief and desperation had a particular quality that couldn't be counterfeited. Kaya Thompson was exactly what she appeared to be, an ordinary woman caught in extraordinary circumstances through nothing more than exhaustion and bad luck. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. Jin-woo glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. Yamamoto's people had been spotted in the building's parking garage, 3 black sedans with tinted windows and license plates registered to shell companies. They were either conducting surveillance or preparing for something more aggressive. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a new edge of urgency, "your timing tonight was unfortunate in more ways than you realize. There are people who would be very interested in what you witnessed, and they don't share my preference for conversation over violence." Kaya felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the implication. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying that your normal life ended the moment you stepped off that elevator," Jin-woo replied, standing and moving to the window to study the street below. "You've seen too much to go back to serving champagne and pretending none of this exists. The question is what happens next." He turned back to face her, his expression serious but not unkind. "I can offer you protection while I decide how to handle this situation," he said. "A secure location, complete safety, time to figure out a long-term solution. The alternative is that you leave here tonight and hope that my competitors don't realize what you know or decide you're worth questioning." Kaya's mind raced as she weighed her options. She could refuse his offer, insist on returning to her normal life, pretend that nothing had happened. But she wasn't naive enough to believe it would be that simple. If rival criminal organizations were already involved, if Jin-woo himself was concerned about her safety, then walking away might be impossible. "What would protection mean exactly?" she asked. "It means you come with me tonight," Jin-woo replied. "It means you disappear from your normal routine until this situation is resolved. It means trusting me to keep you alive while I decide what comes next." Kaya thought of her mother in the hospital bed, waiting for treatment, depending on Kaya's income to survive. She thought of her 3 jobs, her tiny apartment, her careful budget that left no room for error. She thought of the fear in Jin-woo's voice when he mentioned his competitors and the casual way he had described violence as an alternative to conversation. "Do I have a choice?" she asked quietly. Jin-woo's expression softened slightly, the first hint of genuine sympathy she had seen from him. "Everyone has choices, Miss Thompson," he said. "But some choices have consequences that make them impossible to live with." Kaya nodded slowly, understanding that her old life was already over, that the moment she had stepped off that elevator, she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. At least with Jin-woo, she might survive long enough to figure out what came next. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. "I'll come with you." Jin-woo moved to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. "Bring the car around," he said in Korean, then switched back to English. "We're leaving now," he told Kaya. "Stay close to me, do exactly what I say, and don't look back." He retrieved his suit jacket and gun holster from a hidden drawer, the latter a reminder that protection in his world came with the promise of violence. As they moved toward the door, Kaya felt her old life falling away behind her like a discarded skin, leaving her stepping forward into a future that was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. Whatever came next, at least she wouldn't face it alone. The Park family compound sat behind 12-foot concrete walls topped with razor wire and electronic surveillance equipment, occupying an entire city block in Gangnam's most exclusive residential district. As Jin-woo's armored sedan passed through the reinforced steel gates, Kaya caught her breath at the sprawling modern mansion that rose before them like something from an architectural magazine. The main house was 3 stories of glass and white stone, surrounded by manicured gardens that glowed under strategically placed lighting. A separate building housed what appeared to be staff quarters, and she could see the corner of what looked like a swimming pool and tennis court beyond a line of ornamental trees. This wasn't just wealth. It was the kind of generational fortune that built dynasties and commanded respect from governments. Security was everywhere but subtle, from the cameras hidden among the landscaping to the men in expensive suits who moved through the shadows with the fluid efficiency of military professionals. Jinwoo led her through the main entrance, past a foyer dominated by a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than Kaya's lifetime earnings, into a guest wing that felt like a luxury hotel suite. The bedroom was larger than her entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture, and a marble bathroom that featured both a jetted tub and a separate glass shower. Everything was pristine, expensive, and completely foreign to someone who had grown up sharing a bathroom with 3 roommates and shopping for furniture at thrift stores. "You'll stay here tonight," Jinwoo told her, his voice professionally courteous but distant. "There are clothes in the closet that should fit, toiletries in the bathroom, and food in the refrigerator. Don't try to leave the compound or contact anyone from your previous life. I'll have some questions answered by morning, and then we'll discuss your options." He left her alone with those words, and Kaya spent the first hour simply standing in the center of the room, overwhelmed by the contrast between her current surroundings and the tiny studio apartment she'd left behind just hours earlier. The closet contained women's clothing in her exact size, designer pieces with the tags still attached, everything from casual wear to business suits to evening gowns. The refrigerator was stocked with food that actually looked fresh and appetizing, not the discount groceries and expired clearance items that filled her usual diet. The bed was easily twice the size of the narrow twin mattress she'd been sleeping on for the past 2 years, covered in Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like silk against her skin. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the window watching security personnel make their rounds, thinking about her mother alone in the hospital bed, wondering what would happen when she didn't show up for her morning shift at the diner. Her phone had been confiscated during the ride to the compound, cutting her off from the outside world as effectively as if she'd been transported to another planet. By dawn, she had reached a strange kind of peace with her situation. Whatever came next, at least she was alive, at least she had options, at least someone was offering solutions instead of more problems. Jinwoo appeared at her door exactly 12 hours after he had left her, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a different, but equally expensive suit. He looked like he had slept well and spent the morning making important decisions, his dark eyes alert and focused as he studied her face for signs of how the night had affected her. "I've confirmed your story," he said without preamble. Kaya Marie Thompson, age 24, daughter of Patricia Thompson, who is currently receiving treatment for stage 3 breast cancer at Seoul National University Hospital. 3 jobs, $12,000 in medical debt, $847 in savings, rent due in 6 days, no criminal record, no connections to any criminal organizations, no family members with questionable backgrounds. "You are exactly what you appeared to be, an ordinary woman in extraordinary circumstances." Kaya nodded, unsurprised that he had been thorough. In his position, she would have done the same thing. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we discuss terms," Jinwoo replied, settling into the chair across from her with the portfolio balanced on his knees. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Thompson. A way to solve your immediate problems while also solving mine." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper, expensive stationery with what looked like legal language printed in both Korean and English. The numbers at the top of the page made Kaya's vision blur momentarily. $200,000 per year, plus benefits, plus housing, plus medical coverage for immediate family members. "This is what I'm offering," Jinwoo said, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone making a business presentation. $200,000 annually, paid monthly, with all taxes handled through my legitimate business interests. Your mother's medical bills paid in full, including the experimental treatment she needs. Your current debts eliminated completely. Housing provided here on the compound, with your own suite and complete privacy. Medical coverage for both you and your mother through my private physicians. Transportation, security, and anything else you need to live comfortably and safely. Kaya stared at the paper, the numbers seeming too large to be real. In return for what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In return, you become my personal aide and translator, Jinwoo replied. You attend business meetings where your language skills and intelligence would be useful. You provide translation services for international negotiations. You serve as a legitimate front for certain operations that require someone with your background and education. You live here, under my protection, as part of my household staff with a salary that reflects the specialized nature of your position. Kaya's mind raced as she processed the implications. It sounded almost reasonable when he described it that way, like a high-paying executive assistant position with unusual housing requirements. But she wasn't naive enough to believe it was that simple. What do you require from me specifically? She asked. Absolute loyalty, Jinwoo replied without hesitation. Complete silence about anything you see, hear, or learn while in my employ. Your presence at business functions and social events where I need someone who can navigate both American and Korean cultural expectations. Your intelligence and judgment in situations where I need advice from someone outside my usual circle. And your agreement to live here, on this property, where I can guarantee your safety. And if I betray that trust, Kaya said, the question hanging in the air between them. Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a glimpse of the cold calculation that had built his empire. Then your employment ends, your protection ends, and your safety becomes a matter I can no longer guarantee, he said simply. The people who wanted to question you last night don't simply disappear because you're under my roof. They wait. And if you're no longer under my roof, they have no reason to wait any longer. The threat was delivered in the same professional tone he had used to describe the salary, matter-of-fact and utterly convincing. Kaya understood that she was being offered a choice between a golden cage and a death sentence, presented with corporate politeness, but no less binding for the civilized delivery. She thought of her mother's face when the doctor had explained that the experimental treatment was their last hope, the way Patricia Thompson's eyes had filled with resignation when they discussed the cost. She thought of her 3 jobs, the exhaustion that never ended, the bills that kept growing faster than her ability to pay them. She thought of lying awake at night calculating how many shifts she needed to work to afford another month of treatment, knowing that the mathematics of survival were slowly but inevitably tilting against them. This is dirty money, she said, not accusingly, but as a simple statement of fact. Yes, Jinwoo replied, apparently appreciating her directness. Money earned through businesses that exist outside legal boundaries, used to purchase loyalty and silence from people who find themselves in positions where conventional solutions are inadequate. Kaya looked at the contract again, at the numbers that could save her mother's life and eliminate every financial stress that had dominated her existence for the past 2 years. She thought about morality and compromise and the distance between idealism and survival. Maybe morality was a luxury she couldn't afford. Maybe the only sin was letting her mother die when salvation was sitting on the table in front of her. How long? She asked. The initial contract is for 2 years, Jinwoo replied. Renewable by mutual agreement. Terminable by either party with 60 days' notice, provided that certain confidentiality agreements remain in effect permanently. Kaya took a deep breath, understanding that she was about to cross a line that would change everything about who she was and how she moved through the world. But the alternative was watching her mother die while she served champagne to people who spent more on dinner than Patricia Thompson's life insurance policy. I accept, she said, her voice clear and steady. I accept your offer, Mr. Park. Jinwoo smiled then, the first genuine expression of satisfaction she had seen from him. It transformed his face completely, making him look younger and somehow more human, less like a dangerous criminal and more like an accomplished businessman who had just closed an important deal. Welcome to my world, Miss Thompson, he said, producing an expensive pen and sliding the contract across the space between them. Your old life officially ends the moment you sign that paper. Your new one begins immediately. Kaya took the pen, her hand steady as she signed her name in careful script at the bottom of the page. As the ink dried, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. A door closing on the woman who had served drinks and counted pennies. Another opening on someone who still didn't quite exist yet, but who would have the resources to save the person she loved most. Jinwoo countered her signature with his own, then closed the portfolio with a satisfied snap. "Your first assignment is simple," he said. "Rest, recover from last night, and prepare to become someone new. Tomorrow we begin your education in how this world actually works." He stood and moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Your mother's treatment begins this afternoon," he added casually. "I've already spoken with her doctors. They seem optimistic about her chances." Kaya felt tears spring to her eyes for the first time since entering his compound. Relief and gratitude and terror combining into something too complex to name. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Jinwoo replied, but his tone was almost gentle. "Wait until you understand what you've agreed to. Then decide if gratitude is the appropriate response." 6 weeks into her new life, Kaya no longer recognized the woman she had been. The transformation went deeper than the designer clothing that now filled her closet or the way security personnel nodded respectfully when she moved through the compound. Something fundamental had shifted in how she carried herself, how she spoke, how she navigated spaces that had once seemed impossibly foreign. She had learned to read the subtle hierarchies that governed Jinwoo's organization, to distinguish between the men who commanded respect through competence and those who demanded it through fear. Her Korean had improved dramatically through daily conversation and formal lessons, and she could now follow complex business discussions without translation. The real change became apparent during a particularly tense negotiation with Japanese investors who wanted to partner with Jinwoo's legitimate shipping company. The meeting was held in the formal conference room of his downtown office building, a gleaming tower that served as headquarters for Park Industries and provided perfect cover for his less legal operations. 3 men from Tokyo sat across the mahogany table from Jinwoo and his advisors, their expensive suits and careful politeness barely concealing the underlying tension that came from representatives of rival organizations attempting to find common ground. Kaya sat slightly behind Jinwoo, officially present as his translator and cultural liaison, but she could feel the weight of evaluation from both sides. The Japanese delegation had been surprised to see a young black woman in such a position of apparent trust, and Jinwoo's own men were still adjusting to her presence in sensitive meetings. 20 minutes into the discussion, it became clear that the negotiation was failing not because of substantive disagreement, but because of cultural misunderstandings that were making both sides defensive. The lead Japanese negotiator had just made what he clearly thought was a generous concession, but his phrasing in Korean carried implications of condescension that were making Jinwoo's jaw tighten dangerously. Kaya recognized the moment before it escalated into something that could destroy months of careful relationship building. "Mr. Tanaka," she said in perfect Japanese, rising smoothly from her chair, "I believe there may be a translation issue that's creating unnecessary tension. May I suggest a brief recess so that both parties can ensure we're all understanding each other correctly?" The room went silent as everyone processed her intervention. She had spoken directly to the Japanese delegation in their own language, bypassed the formal translation process, and suggested a face-saving solution that acknowledged the problem without assigning blame. It was either brilliantly diplomatic or a career-ending mistake, and for a moment Kaya wasn't certain which. Then Tanaka smiled, a genuine expression of relief and appreciation. "That would be very wise, Miss Thompson," he replied in Japanese. "Perhaps you could help us understand where our communication has become unclear." For the next hour, Kaya served as more than a translator. She became a cultural bridge, explaining the nuances that were getting lost in formal language, helping both sides understand not just what was being said, but what was meant. She guided the conversation away from areas of sensitivity and toward points of genuine mutual interest, drawing on her knowledge of both American directness and Asian face-saving protocols. By the end of the meeting, what had been a failing negotiation had become the foundation for a partnership worth millions in legitimate business revenue. Jinwoo said very little during the drive back to the compound, but Kaya could feel his attention like a physical presence. She had exceeded his expectations in a way that made her value to his organization exponentially greater than he had initially calculated. She wasn't just useful as a translator or cultural consultant. She was gifted at reading people, at finding solutions to complex interpersonal problems, at making his business more profitable and his operations more sophisticated. That evening, He found her in the library that adjoined her suite, reading a book on international trade law that she had requested from his extensive business collection. She looked up as he entered, noting that he had changed from his business suit into casual clothes that somehow made him seem more approachable, but no less commanding. His dark hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it, and there was a quality of thoughtfulness in his expression that she had learned to recognize as his planning mode. "You saved me $2 million today," he said without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from her reading nook. "Tanaka was ready to walk away before you intervened. That partnership will be profitable for both our organizations for years to come." "I was just doing my job," Kaya replied, though she couldn't hide her satisfaction at his recognition. The cultural barriers were obvious once you understood what was really happening. Jinwoo studied her for a long moment, taking in the way she had unconsciously relaxed in his presence, the easy confidence that had replaced her initial fear. "You're not just doing your job anymore," he said quietly. "You're thinking like a partner, seeing the bigger picture, taking initiative that goes far beyond what I hired you to do." "Is that a problem?" Kaya asked, suddenly uncertain whether she had overstepped some boundary she didn't understand. "No," Jinwoo replied, his voice carrying a warmth that was becoming increasingly familiar during their evening conversations. "It's remarkable. You've adapted to this world faster than people who were born into it. You see opportunities that my advisors miss, solutions that my experience overlooks. You're not just competent, Kaya. You're exceptional." The use of her first name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, a recognition of how their relationship had gradually shifted from formal employer-employee interactions to something more personal. They had begun having dinner together most evenings, conversations that started with business but often wandered into literature, philosophy, travel, dreams for the future. She had learned that Jinwoo was more than the cold criminal mastermind she had first encountered. He was intelligent, well-read, surprisingly thoughtful about art and culture, capable of humor that was dry but genuinely funny. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could consider whether it was wise to voice it. "Why did you really keep me alive that first night?" The truth, not the strategic explanation. Jinwoo's expression grew serious, and for a moment she thought he might deflect or change the subject. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because you reminded me of someone," he said quietly. "Someone I failed to protect when it mattered most." He was quiet for so long that Kaya thought he might not continue. But then he began speaking in a voice that carried the weight of old grief carefully controlled. "I had a younger sister," he said. "Eugen. She was 3 years younger than me. Everything good and kind and innocent that I never was. When our parents died, I was 25 and building what would become this organization. She was 22 and working as a teacher, trying to make the world better through education and hope. I was so focused on accumulating power, on ensuring that no one could ever threaten our family again, that I didn't notice she was in trouble." Kaya remained perfectly still, recognizing that this was the kind of vulnerability that Jinwoo never shared, information that could be weaponized against him if it reached the wrong people. "She started dating someone," Jinwoo continued, his hands clenching slightly as he spoke. "He seemed nice, successful, the kind of man our parents would have approved of. But he was connected to the Yamamoto syndicate, and he was using her to gather information about my operations. By the time I realized what was happening, by the time I understood that she was in danger because of my business, it was too late. They killed her to send me a message about territorial boundaries and respect." The pain in his voice was raw, immediate, as if the loss had happened days rather than years ago. Kaya felt her heart clench with sympathy for the young man who had built an empire to protect his family only to lose the person who mattered most. "I could have saved her if I had been paying attention," Jinwoo said. "If I had been the kind of brother who noticed when someone he loved was afraid, who put family before business, who understood that all the power in the world means nothing if you can't protect the people who make life worth living. But I was too busy being important, too focused on being feared, too convinced that money and influence would solve every problem." He looked up at Kaya then, his eyes holding a vulnerability that transformed his face completely. "When I saw you that night, terrified but refusing to beg, honest even when lying would have been safer, I saw the courage that Eugen had. The strength that comes from choosing dignity over survival, from being who you are even when it might cost you everything. I couldn't save my sister, but I could save you. I could make a different choice this time. Kaya felt tears prick her eyes as she understood the weight of what he had shared with her. You're not responsible for what happened to her, she said softly. You were young. You were building something from nothing. You couldn't have known. I should have known, Jinwoo replied. And because I didn't, because I failed when it mattered most, I live with the knowledge that every choice I make is colored by that failure, including the choice to keep you here, to offer you protection that comes with its own dangers. As if summoned by his words, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. Jinwoo glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened immediately, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the mask of the crime boss who had survived by never showing weakness. What is it? Kaya asked, recognizing the shift in his demeanor. Yamamoto's people have been asking questions about you, Jinwoo replied, his voice returning to the controlled tone she had learned to associate with serious threats. They know you exist, they know you live here, and they're trying to determine how much you know about my operations. Which means you're no longer just someone I'm protecting. You're a target in your own right. Kaya felt the familiar chill of fear, but it was different now, tempered by 6 weeks of learning how Jinwoo's world operated. She was no longer the naive server who had stumbled into danger by accident. She understood the stakes, the players, the rules that govern survival in his environment. What does that mean for me? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. It means that my protection becomes more necessary and more dangerous at the same time, Jinwoo replied. They won't try to take you directly, not while you're here, but they'll look for opportunities to separate you from my security, to get you alone long enough to question you about what you've seen and learned. And they won't be as patient or as civilized about it as I was. He stood and moved to the window, studying the compound's security measures with the eye of someone who had survived multiple assassination attempts. But I want you to understand something, Kaya, he said, turning back to face her. Nothing will happen to you while you're under my protection. I failed my sister, but I will not fail you. The choice to keep you safe is no longer about business or convenience or strategic advantage. It's personal now. Kaya felt her pulse quicken at the intensity in his voice, at the promise that went far beyond their original contract. She realized that somewhere in the past 6 weeks, Jinwoo had stopped being just her dangerous employer and had become something more complicated, more meaningful, more potentially devastating to her carefully guarded heart. Thank you, she said quietly, the words carrying weight far beyond simple gratitude. Don't thank me yet, Jinwoo replied, but his smile was gentle, intimate, the expression of a man who had found something worth protecting and would do whatever was necessary to keep it safe. Thank me when this is over and you're still whole and free to choose whatever life you want. But as he said the words, both of them understood that the life she might choose and the life she had stumbled into 6 weeks ago were becoming increasingly difficult to separate. The attack came during what should have been the safest part of Kaya's week. For the past month, Jinwoo had allowed her supervised visits to Seoul National University Hospital to spend time with her mother, whose treatment was progressing better than anyone had dared hope. The experimental therapy was working, the tumors shrinking, and for the first time in 2 years Patricia Thompson was talking about plans for the future instead of preparing for the end. Kaya treasured these Wednesday afternoon visits, 2 hours when she could pretend to be an ordinary daughter visiting her recovering mother, when the weight of her new life lifted just enough to let her breathe normally. She had just left Patricia's room, her heart light with the news that next week's scans were expected to show continued improvement, when she noticed the 3 men in expensive suits loitering near the elevator bank. Something about their positioning felt wrong, too deliberate, too coordinated for casual hospital visitors. Her training kicked in immediately, the situational awareness that Jinwoo's security team had drilled into her over the past weeks. She altered her route toward the stairwell, her phone already in her hand, to speed dial the emergency contact that would bring immediate backup. The men moved to intercept her with professional efficiency that confirmed her worst fears. They weren't hospital visitors or random criminals. They were specialists, the kind of operatives who planned extractions and eliminated witnesses for a living. Kaya's blood turned to ice as she recognized the coordinated movement patterns, The way they positioned themselves to cut off her escape routes, the casual confidence that came from men who had done this many times before. "Miss Thompson," the lead operative said in accented English, his tone politely conversational despite the circumstances. "We'd like to have a conversation with you. Somewhere private, where we won't be interrupted." Kaya's mind raced as she calculated her options. The hospital was public enough that they couldn't simply grab her without causing a scene, but isolated enough that help might not arrive in time if they decided to use force. Her security detail was positioned in the parking garage and main lobby, following Jinwoo's instructions to maintain distance during her visits to avoid drawing attention to her mother's location. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm just visiting my mother. I don't have any information that would interest you." The man smiled, an expression that carried no warmth and considerable menace. "We believe you have information about Park Jinwoo's operations that would be very valuable to our organization. Financial records, security procedures, business relationships. The kind of details that someone in your position would naturally observe." Two more men appeared at the far end of the corridor, blocking her retreat toward her mother's room. They were trying to herd her toward a service elevator that would take them to an isolated area where interrogation could proceed without interference. Kaya realized that Jinwoo's warnings about the Yamamoto syndicate had been understated. These men weren't interested in a polite conversation. They were here to extract information through whatever means necessary, and her survival was a secondary consideration at best. "I don't know anything about Mr. Park's business," she said, backing slowly toward the nurse's station where hospital security cameras and potential witnesses might provide some protection. "I'm just his translator. I attend public meetings and handle correspondence." The lead operative's expression shifted to something colder, more dangerous. "Miss Thompson, we know exactly who you are and what you've been doing for the past 2 months. You live in his compound, attend private meetings, have access to his personal schedule and security arrangements. You know where he sleeps, who he trusts, how he thinks. That information is worth millions to the right buyer." Kaya felt her heart hammering against her ribs as the men began closing the distance between them. Her training had covered this scenario, but experiencing it was completely different from practicing responses in the safety of Jinwoo's compound. These were killers who viewed her as a resource to be exploited, and they had clearly done their homework about her value and vulnerability. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call just as the men made their move. She hit the answer button and screamed Jinwoo's name as hands grabbed her arms, professional grips designed to control without leaving obvious bruises. The phone clattered to the floor as she struggled, her voice echoing through the hospital corridor as she fought against her captors with desperation born of absolute terror. The operative who had been speaking reached for her phone to end the call, but it was too late. Jinwoo's voice could be heard through the speaker, cold and deadly, and promising immediate consequences for whoever had dared to touch what belonged to him. 15 minutes later, the hospital's main entrance and parking garage were surrounded by black vehicles with tinted windows. Jinwoo emerged from the lead car wearing a long coat that concealed the body armor and weapons he had hastily equipped, his expression carrying the kind of controlled fury that had built his reputation as someone who never forgot an injury and never failed to respond with overwhelming force. His security team spread through the building with military precision, sealing exits and identifying threats with the efficiency of men who had trained for exactly this scenario. The Yamamoto operatives had made a critical error in their timing. They had assumed that taking Kaya during her hospital visit would give them time to extract her from the building before Jinwoo could respond, but they had underestimated both the speed of his response and the extent of his preparation for protecting her. By the time they reached the service elevator with their struggling captive, the building was already locked down and their escape routes had been eliminated. Jinwoo found them on the 3rd floor, for men in expensive suits surrounding Kaya in what had been intended as a temporary holding area while they arranged transportation to a more secure interrogation site. The lead operative was on the phone with his superior, arguing in rapid Japanese about the unexpected complications, when Jinwoo stepped into the room with 2 of his most dangerous associates. "Release her," Jinwoo said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that brooked no discussion or negotiation. "Now." The operative ended his phone call and turned to face Jin Woo with professional composure that couldn't quite hide his recognition that the situation had gone badly wrong. "Mr. Park," he said in careful English, "we were hoping to discuss a mutually beneficial business arrangement with Miss Thompson. She has information that could be valuable to both our organizations." Jin Woo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air, a sense of imminent violence that made even experienced killers step back involuntarily. "There is no arrangement," he said softly. "There is no negotiation. There is no conversation. You touched what belongs to me, and now you face the consequences of that choice." What happened next was brutal and efficient and completely one-sided. Jin Woo's men moved with lethal precision while he focused entirely on reaching Kaya, who was pressed against the far wall with wide eyes that held terror and relief in equal measure. The Yamamoto operatives were professionals, but they were vastly outnumbered and fighting on territory that Jin Woo controlled absolutely. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes and ended with 4 bodies and a message that would be delivered to their organization about the cost of threatening Park Jin-woo's personal interests. Kaya found herself in Jin Woo's arms before the echoes of gunfire had faded, his hands running over her face and shoulders to confirm that she was uninjured while his eyes searched hers for signs of trauma or shock. She was trembling but unhurt, her voice steady as she assured him that they hadn't had time to do more than grab her and make threats. But Jin Woo wasn't listening to her words. He was seeing the bruises on her arms where they had gripped her, the tear in her blouse from the struggle, the fear that lingered in her eyes despite her brave attempt at composure. Something fundamental had broken inside him when he heard her scream his name over the phone, a recognition that losing her would destroy something essential about who he was becoming. "I can't," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion that he had never allowed anyone to witness before. "I can't lose you, Kaya. I can't go through that again. I can't survive watching someone I care about disappear because I wasn't fast enough, smart enough, ruthless enough to keep them safe." Kaya stared at him, recognizing that his carefully maintained control had finally cracked, that the vulnerability he had shared about his sister was nothing compared to what she was seeing now. This was Jin Woo without his armor, without his strategic calculations, without anything except raw fear at the thought of losing her. "You didn't lose me," she said softly, her hands reaching up to frame his face, to ground him in the reality of her presence. "I'm here. I'm safe. You saved me. You're not just under my protection anymore," Jin Woo said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're not my employee or my responsibility or someone I'm keeping safe out of obligation. You're mine, Kaya. Mine to protect, mine to care for, mine to keep safe from anyone who would dare to threaten you." The possession in his voice should have frightened her, should have reminded her of how dangerous he was, how much power he held over her life. Instead, it sent heat racing through her veins, a recognition that she had been his for weeks without admitting it to herself. The careful professional boundaries they had maintained, the polite distance that had slowly eroded through shared dinners and long conversations, the growing attraction that neither had acknowledged directly, all of it collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying weight far beyond simple agreement. "I'm yours, Jin Woo. And you're mine." He kissed her then, desperate and claiming and full of the fear that had driven him across the city to reach her. It was nothing like the gentle exploration she might have expected, nothing careful or questioning or polite. It was possession and relief and promise all wrapped together, the kiss of a man who had nearly lost something precious and would never risk it again. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jin Woo's expression had shifted to something harder, more dangerous, more final. "The people who did this," he said quietly, his arms still wrapped around her as if he might never let her go. "They will never threaten you again. Or anyone else, for that matter." Kaya understood what he was telling her, the scope of the response that would follow this attack. She should have been horrified by the casual way he discussed eliminating entire organizations, by the violence that would be unleashed in her name. Instead, she felt a fierce satisfaction at the knowledge that Jin Woo would make them pay for every moment of terror they had caused her. "Good," she said simply, and meant it. Jin Woo smiled then, an expression of dark satisfaction and complete understanding. This was who they were together, A man who would burn the world to keep her safe, and a woman who would stand beside him while he did it. The transformation was complete, the last pretense of a business arrangement finally abandoned. She was no longer just protected. She was claimed, possessed, cherished with the single-minded devotion of a man who had found something worth fighting for and would never let it go. 3 months after the hospital attack, Kaya stood in the executive boardroom of Park Industries, watching Jinwoo negotiate the acquisition of a major shipping company, while simultaneously coordinating the elimination of the last remnants of the Yamamoto Syndicate's sole operations. The juxtaposition had become natural to her. Legitimate business conducted with handshakes and contracts in glass towers, while darker business was handled through encrypted phone calls and coded language that left no traces for law enforcement to follow. She had learned to navigate both worlds with equal skill, serving as Jinwoo's translator and cultural liaison in boardrooms during the day, his trusted counsel and partner in the shadows when night fell. The woman who had once served champagne to people she couldn't afford to offend had been replaced by someone who commanded respect in rooms full of powerful men, who could negotiate million-dollar contracts in 3 languages, who understood the subtle balance of legitimate business and criminal enterprise that kept Jinwoo's empire profitable and protected. Her transformation was complete, but felt natural, as if she had finally grown into the person she was always meant to become. Her mother's recovery had exceeded every medical prediction. Patricia Thompson was not only cancer-free, but thriving, her health restored by treatments that would have been impossible without Jinwoo's intervention. She had moved from the cramped apartment where she had been slowly dying into a comfortable house in a safe neighborhood, with a garden she tended with the enthusiasm of someone who had been given a second chance at life. The experimental therapy had not only eliminated the cancer, but had given Patricia energy and hope that she hadn't possessed in years. The guilt that Kaya had expected to feel about the source of her mother's salvation had never materialized. Instead, she felt a fierce gratitude toward the man who had given her the power to save the person she loved most, who had transformed her from a desperate daughter watching helplessly into someone with the resources to ensure that Patricia Thompson would live to see her grandchildren grow up. The mathematics of morality had proven simpler than she had anticipated. Saving her mother's life was worth whatever compromises it required. Jinwoo caught her eye across the boardroom and smiled, the expression transforming his face from the controlled mask he wore during business meetings into something warm and intimate that was meant only for her. 6 months ago, that smile would have terrified her with its implications of possession and control. Now it sent warmth spreading through her chest, a recognition of the depth of devotion that lay beneath his careful public composure. The shipping acquisition was completed with the efficiency that characterized all of Jinwoo's legitimate business dealings. Handshakes exchanged and contracts signed, while his lawyers ensured that every detail would withstand regulatory scrutiny. As the other executives filed out of the boardroom, Jinwoo moved to stand beside Kaya at the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Seoul's financial district. 37 companies, he said quietly, his voice carrying satisfaction at another strategic victory. From shipping to real estate to technology consulting, all providing perfect cover for the operations that actually matter. In 5 years, Park Industries will be large enough to influence government policy, legitimate enough to court international investors, profitable enough to make every other syndicate in Asia jealous of our success, and untouchable enough to protect everyone you care about, Kaya added, understanding the real motivation behind his empire building. She had learned that every legitimate acquisition was chosen not just for profitability, but for the additional layers of protection it provided to his family, his organization, and most importantly to her. Jinwoo turned to study her face, taking in the confident way she carried herself, the designer suit that fit her perfectly, the security earpiece that kept her connected to his protection detail at all times. You've become everything I hoped you would, he said softly. Partner, advisor, the intelligent voice that keeps me grounded when power threatens to corrupt my judgment. But more than that, you've become the reason I build all of this. Kaya felt her pulse quicken at the intensity in his voice, at the implication of what he might be preparing to say. In the 3 months since the hospital attack, Their relationship had deepened beyond mere possession and protection into something that felt like genuine partnership, like the joining of two people who complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. But they had never discussed the future beyond the immediate need to eliminate threats and consolidate power. Jinwoo reached into his jacket and withdrew a small black velvet box that made Kaya's breath catch in her throat. Not because she was surprised, exactly, but because the reality of what it represented was both thrilling and terrifying in its permanence. "Marry me," he said simply, opening the box to reveal a diamond ring that was beautiful in its elegant simplicity rather than its size. Chosen for someone who understood that true luxury lay in perfect quality rather than ostentatious display. "Not because I own you or because you owe me gratitude for what I've done. Marry me because I love you, because you make me better than I would be alone, because I want to spend the rest of my life protecting and cherishing and building something meaningful with you." The proposal was everything she had come to expect from Jinwoo. Direct, honest, free of manipulation or false promises. He wasn't asking her to marry him because she was trapped or dependent or grateful. He was asking because he loved her, and because she had proven that she could stand beside him as an equal partner rather than a rescued victim. "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice steady and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jinwoo. Not because I need your protection anymore, but because I love you too. Because what we've built together is worth making permanent." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that were surprisingly gentle for someone whose reputation was built on controlled violence, then kissed her with the tenderness that he showed only to her. Only in moments when they were alone and his carefully maintained armor could be set aside. This was Jinwoo as few people ever saw him. Vulnerable, devoted, capable of the kind of deep emotion that would have been seen as weakness by his enemies, but which Kaya knew was actually his greatest strength. The engagement was announced that evening at a private dinner attended by Jinwoo's inner circle and Kaya's mother, a gathering that blended Korean and American traditions in a way that honored both their backgrounds. Patricia Thompson had initially been shocked by the speed and intensity of her daughter's relationship with a man she knew was dangerous, but she had also seen how Kaya had flourished under Jinwoo's protection, how she had grown from a desperate young woman into someone confident and powerful and genuinely happy. The wedding planning became an exercise in merging two worlds that had never been meant to intersect. Korean traditions that honored Jinwoo's heritage were combined with American customs that acknowledged Kaya's upbringing, creating a ceremony that felt authentic to both of them, while satisfying the political requirements of an event that would be attended by legitimate business leaders and criminal organization heads in equal measure. The guest list required security clearances and background checks. The venue needed to accommodate bulletproof glass and escape routes, and the catering had to account for dietary restrictions and potential poisoning attempts. But beneath the complexity of marrying into a criminal empire, the essential elements remained simple. Two people who had found each other in impossible circumstances and chosen to build something lasting from the foundation of mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared understanding of what it meant to protect the people you loved at any cost. The final threat to their future came not from rival organizations or law enforcement investigations, but from Jinwoo's own past, in the form of his former mentor who had trained him in the brutal efficiency that had built his empire. Kim Dae-young was 70 years old, legendarily ruthless, and convinced that Jinwoo's attachment to Kaya represented a dangerous weakness that would eventually destroy everything they had built together. The confrontation took place in the private dining room where Kaya had first encountered Jinwoo's world, a symbolic return to the beginning that felt appropriate for what was meant to be the final resolution of his violent past. Kim Dae-young had requested the meeting under the pretense of discussing territorial agreements, but his true purpose became clear when he suggested that Kaya's influence was making Jinwoo soft, too concerned with legitimate business and long-term stability to maintain the fear that kept their enemies in check. "You think love makes you stronger," the older man said in Korean, his tone carrying the dismissive authority of someone who had never allowed emotion to influence his strategic decisions. "But it makes you predictable, vulnerable, weak. Your enemies will target her to control you, and when they do, you will make choices based on her safety rather than organizational strength. It is a flaw that will destroy us all." Jinwoo listened to the criticism with perfect composure, his expression revealing nothing of the cold rage that was building behind his controlled facade. When Kim Dae-young finished speaking, Jinwoo responded in a voice that carried absolute finality. "You mistake ruthlessness for strength," he said quietly. "You think that isolation and fear are the only sources of power. But you're wrong. Kaya doesn't make me weak. She makes me more dangerous than I've ever been. Because now I have something worth protecting that goes beyond money or territory or reputation. Now I have a reason to ensure that nothing and no one can threaten what I've built." The older man smiled with condescending patience. "Sentiment," he said dismissively. "It will be your downfall, just as it was your father's." Jinwoo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room's atmosphere, a sense of imminent violence that made even Kim Dae-jung's bodyguards shift nervously. "My father died because he trusted the wrong people," Jinwoo replied. "Because he believed that loyalty could be purchased with money and intimidation. I learned from his mistakes. I know the difference between fear and respect, between submission and genuine loyalty. And I know that the people who truly matter to me are worth any risk, any sacrifice, any amount of violence necessary to keep them safe." What followed was swift and decisive and completely without mercy. Kim Dae-young had made the mistake of threatening not just Jinwoo's authority, but his personal happiness, and the response was calibrated to ensure that no one would ever make that error again. The message sent to every organization in Asia was clear. Park Jinwoo's power was absolute, his reach unlimited, and his willingness to protect what mattered to him knew no boundaries whatsoever. 1 year later, Kaya stood in the nursery of their private residence, watching Jinwoo cradle their 3-month-old daughter with the reverent care of a man who had never expected to experience the simple miracle of holding his own child. Minjun Park Thompson, named to honor both her Korean father and her American mother, slept peacefully in arms that were strong enough to eliminate enemies, but gentle enough to soothe a fussy infant. The transformation of their lives from criminal enterprise to legitimate dynasty had been completed with characteristic efficiency. Park Industries was now one of Seoul's most influential corporations, with international partnerships and government contracts that provided perfect cover for the much smaller criminal operations that continued to fund their real security. Jinwoo's reputation had evolved from feared crime boss to respected business leader, though everyone who mattered understood that the transformation was strategic rather than genuine, that his capacity for violence remained unchanged even if it was rarely displayed. Kaya's own evolution had been equally dramatic. She was no longer the desperate young woman who had stumbled into Jinwoo's world through exhaustion and bad luck. She was now the co-owner of a business empire, the mother of a child who would grow up with every advantage that wealth and power could provide, the wife of a man who had proven that his devotion was absolute and his protection was permanent. Her Korean was now flawless, her understanding of international business sophisticated, her ability to navigate both legitimate and criminal worlds effortless. More importantly, she had discovered that her mother's diagnosis had been wrong in one crucial respect. Patricia Thompson had not been dying of cancer, but had been slowly poisoned by environmental toxins from the factory where she had worked for 15 years. Jinwoo's investigation into her medical history had uncovered the corporate negligence responsible for her illness, and his legal team had secured a settlement that would have been impossible for a working-class family to pursue independently. Justice served with efficiency that the courts could never have matched. The circle that had begun with Kaya serving champagne to people who barely noticed her existence had closed with her employing young women in similar circumstances, providing them with opportunities for education and advancement that might otherwise have remained forever beyond their reach. Park Industries had established a scholarship program for working students, a medical assistance fund for families facing impossible healthcare costs, and a job training program that had helped hundreds of people transition from poverty to stability. It was, Kaya reflected, the kind of legacy that her younger self would never have imagined building, accomplished through methods that her moral education had never anticipated approving. But the mathematics of change had proven simple. Power used wisely could accomplish good things that powerlessness made impossible, and the source of that power mattered less than the uses to which it was put. Jinwoo approached her as she stood by the window watching their security team conduct their evening rounds, his arms sliding around her waist from behind as he rested his chin against her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked quietly, the question carrying weight because he genuinely needed to know that she had no regrets about the choices that had brought them to this moment. "Yes," she replied, leaning back against him with complete trust and contentment. "I'm happy. We built something good, Jinwoo. Something that will last. Something that protects the people we care about and creates opportunities for others who need them. I never could have imagined this life when I was working 3 jobs and counting every dollar. But I can't imagine any other life now." "Good," he murmured against her hair. "Because this is only the beginning. Minjun will grow up in a world where she never has to choose between her values and her family's survival, where she has the power to protect what matters to her and the resources to help others do the same. She'll be stronger than both of us because she'll start with advantages we had to fight for." Kaya smiled at the vision of their daughter's future, at the foundation of security and opportunity they had built for her. "Sometimes the wrong door leads to exactly the right life," she said, echoing the words that had become their private joke about the night that had changed everything. "Sometimes the wrong door leads to the right person," Jinwoo corrected gently. "And sometimes the right person makes even the darkest path worth walking." As Seoul's lights glittered beyond their windows and their daughter slept peacefully in the next room, Kaya understood that she had found something rare and precious. A love that was strong enough to transform both of them. A partnership that had created something meaningful from the wreckage of their separate struggles. A future that was secure because it had been built by 2 people who understood the true cost of protecting what mattered most. The woman who had once stumbled into the wrong elevator carrying someone else's champagne had become someone who owned the building, who employed the servers, who ensured that other young women in desperate circumstances had better options than she had possessed. It was the kind of transformation that could only happen when protection became partnership, when possession became devotion, when 2 people discovered that together they were capable of building something that neither could have achieved alone. She was no longer just protected. She was no longer just possessed. She was loved, cherished, and empowered in ways that would have seemed impossible 6 years ago when she had been counting dollars toward her mother's survival and hoping for miracles that never seemed to come. The miracle had come, but not in any form she could have anticipated. It had arrived in the shape of a dangerous man who had seen something worth saving and had been willing to give her the power to save herself. Now they stood together in the empire they had built, watching their daughter sleep, planning a future that was limitless because they had learned that the most important protection was the kind that came from having someone who would move heaven and earth to keep you safe. Forever protection, forever partnership, forever love. It was, Kaya thought as Jinwoo's arms tightened around her, exactly the right ending to a story that had begun with all the wrong choices leading to all the right places.